Are there disputes about it? Is there any traditions within the Islamic civilization where some people argued against the existence of God through some various types of philosophical or practical kinds of arguments?
Well, I think you've always had atheists and agnostics. That goes back to the ancient peoples. I mean, you have before Christ, you have Lucippus, you have people like Lucretius, who are materialist. De Rerum Natura is a great work in the Western tradition that looks at that. So within the Islamic tradition, you do have people that did not believe. You had arguments for why people shouldn't believe. Some of the great disbelievers debated openly, like in Iraq. Abu Hanifa is famous for debating materialists. There's a great story of one of his debates where he showed up very late, and the man complained about him being late, and he said, unfortunately, he was stopped at the river, and there was no boat to get him across the Tigris, but fortunately a tree fell and formed into a boat, so he was able to come across and be on time, be there for the thing. And the man said, "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." And he said, "Well, your argument that all of this just appeared naturally without any maker is as absurd to me as the idea that a tree turned into a boat on its own."
How does Islam address the problem of evil?
If I have a cloak and I burn the cloak, you can say, "Why are you burning that perfectly good cloak?" And I say, "Well, it happens to be infected with a very dangerous infectious disease." So us judging why God does things is something that the Muslims have really shied away from. The Quran says God will not be asked about what he does, but you will be asked about what you do. And so obviously there are different theodicies. There's a theodicy that, and by theodicy I mean the explanations of evil, of why there is evil. And certainly one of the most important ones is the existence is binary. And the Quran says in the 36th chapter that God has created everything in pairs. And so in order for good to be known, there has to be evil. The Arabs say, by opposites, things are known. And also moral agency, because we have natural evil, like a tsunami, and then we have moral evil, which is where a moral agent does something. If a lion eats a human being, we can't impose on that lion our moral sensibilities and say that it was evil, although people do that and will kill the animal for doing something that by its nature it does. But we can question our own actions, and I think one of the greatest arguments for the existence of God is why we're offended by evil. It's not a problem in the same way that you find in the Western tradition. I think the Muslims really did not, because they saw that this is God's dominion, and you cannot be an oppressor in your own dominion if everything belongs to you. What you do with it is your own business. And so there was this idea that the world is filled with good, and it's filled with difficulty, and it's filled with joy and sorrow. And these are all ways in which human beings grow. They can only be understood if it's only this world, then absolutely, it doesn't make any sense. But if you have a day of judgment where rights are wrong, there's a verse in the Quran that says, "La dhulma al-yawm," there is no oppression on this day. Everybody will have their due. Those who were merciful in the world, mercy will be shown to them. Those who were judgmental in the world, like Christ said, by the standard by which ye judge, you too shall be judged. So if you were somebody who always wanted justice in the world, God will give you justice in the next world. But for those of us, I'm much more interested in mercy. Like, I want to see a social mercy movement as opposed to a social justice movement, because I think a lot of what's happening in the world is actually our just desserts for being who we are. So I just wanted to add to that, that one of the, in Arabic, the word for evil has a lot of different meanings. It's not so much evil per se, but like poverty is called shar. That's the word. So anything that's deficient is called evil. And one of the things that I think people ask, where is God with all these horrors in the world? But from a Muslim perspective, God has more right to ask us as our creator, where are you? Because the Quran says, had it not been for some people to constrain other people, the entire world would be filled with evil. And so I think it's really important to remember one of the things that Helen Keller said is that while the world is filled with evil, it's also filled with the overcoming of evil. And I think we often focus solely on the evil and use that as an excuse for not recognizing the extraordinary good that exists in the world.
Your essay, The Prayer of the Oppressed, was a very long and thoughtful approach to our own personal situation. And obviously, God is in that. Does that concept of the prayer of the oppressed, does that lead to avenues that could lead to God?
One of the quickest ways in which people begin to actually awaken to the possibility of God is when they're confronted with great pain and suffering. It opens up the heart. There's a tradition of our prophet, peace be upon him, that says that God is with the brokenhearted. That very often it's the breaking of the heart that allows the light of God to come into the heart. So I think it's very important to recognize that from our perspective, suffering is redemptive. Suffering is something that can actually be an incredible catalyst for spiritual growth and change. One of the things, knowledge of God in the Islamic tradition, although we have a very profound scholastic tradition and we have great theologians who used philosophy to make their arguments, but there's also a very, I think, profound, simple belief that inheres in just the common Muslim that's quite stunning. And I think you see this in other faith traditions where the faith is deeply rooted. The way that they deal with suffering, the way they deal with pain, the way they deal with loss in life is quite extraordinary. I think that becomes a very profound proof of the power of faith to enhance our lives and to make our lives. Marx said that faith was an opium of the masses, but what a lot of people, they quote that, but what he actually said was that faith was the cry of a heart in an unjust world. It was a cri de coeur of an unjust world. And so in essence, what he was saying was religion numbs the pain of the world. Well, one of the things that Marxists and their minions and others have done is they've gotten rid of religion. And so now I would argue opium has become the opium of the masses. Like people need opium to numb the pain of the world, whereas in the past it was by turning to God that one found solace. And we have great examples of that.
There is in Islam, as in many of the traditions, a mystical tradition. Can religious and mystical experiences tell us about God? For example, Islamic mystics, do they know more about God than Islamic non-mystics? Or for that matter, do they know more than analytical philosophers of religion?
There's a great story of a great philosopher, Ibn Rushd, who met with a great mystic who was also a scholar and a philosopher, but he's primarily known for his mysticism. And his name was Ibn Arabi. So Averroes said to him, is what we arrive at the same as what you arrive at? In other words, is our discursive knowledge of God the same as your experiential knowledge of God? And Ibn Arabi is reported to have said, yes. And then Ibn Rushd smiled, and then Ibn Arabi said no. And so I think, in the Islamic tradition, experiential knowledge of God is far more profound than discursive knowledge of God. One of the great scholars and mystics of Islam, Ibn Ata'illah, who was from Egypt, he said that that the attempt to prove the existence of God is from the perspective of the absence of God. And then he says, but when was God absent that he needed to be proved? And so the idea is that there are people that genuinely experience God. One of in that same book, which is called the Aphorisms, translated by Victor Danner, a good translation in English. One of the things that he says is, whoever knows the truth sees the truth in everything. And so the Quran says we created the heavens and the earth with truth. So there is goodness in everything. And that's why that knowledge of God, which is a natural knowledge of God, is much more powerful than the artificial knowledge that comes through this discursive thinking. Intuition, and this is what Imam al-Ghazali writes in his famous Munqidh min al-Dalal, the savior from error. He writes that he studied these different ways of knowing, like epistemology, and concluded that the most profound way was the way of direct experience, what's called in Arabic ma'rifah, or gnosis of God. It's a direct, immediate experience of God. And it's far more profound, especially for the person, obviously, that experiences it, but to believe in it is a type of experience. So those of us who might not have had the experience, we believe in those who have. And certainly the prophets are the foremost among them.
For those of us who have not had such experiences and seek to know God, are we in an inferior position then?
I think in terms of a degree of understanding, absolutely. The problem is, obviously, there are a lot of charlatans that abuse this type of knowledge for those who believe in it that haven't experienced it, and you find that too many of our religions and of our sects are filled with these type of people who claim to have this knowledge. Right. And usually one of the signs that they don't have the knowledge is that they make the claim that they have the knowledge.
I like that.
That's our tradition. It's a big red flag, because the true Gnostics are people that Imam al-Ghazali says that a tree that has great fruit, the branches hang low. And so there's a type of humility that comes with that, that they don't see themselves as anything.
I've worried that if I had, which I've not had, that type of mystical experience, I would not believe it. I would think it's some neurochemical imbalance that I had, or not enough sleep, or some other explanation. So what is it that can differentiate?
We have a whole science of that. So we have a science in our tradition that deals with mystical experiences. So, for instance, there's experiences that are outward terrestrial sensory experiences. Then there's outward terrestrial meaning experiences, outward celestial meaning experiences. Then there's inward terrestrial sensory experiences, like, for instance, some certain psychotropic drugs are very similar. Like I actually believe that I had a profound mystical experience on fentanyl. It wasn't illegal. It was actually given to me in the hospital. But I had an extraordinary experience. And William James writes about this in Varieties of Religious Experience. So I think drugs, unfortunately, are one of the vehicles for opening a lot of people up to the possibility, because there's an experience that there's more here than meets the eye, quite literally. And I think materialists try to reduce those things to neurological phenomena. But the reality of it is that consciousness itself is a spiritual experience. People ask me, I want to have a spiritual experience. My response to that is, you are having a spiritual experience. It's just mediated through your sensoria. But this whole thing is mystical. Consciousness is mysticism. The fact that we can communicate and speak in language, the fact that I can say these words, I don't know where they're coming from, and you don't know where yours are coming from. The fact that I'm speaking at this rapid rate and your mind is digesting all of these things, putting them together. You have all this past experience that enables you to even understand what I'm talking about. This phenomena, which is happening constantly, it's miraculous. And it's just amazing that people in this kind of perfunctory attitude towards existence, I feel sorry for them.
From the standpoint of Islam, do all or most religions, the ones we know, worship the same God?
Do they worship the same God? I think we're all, particularly in the Abrahamic religions, we're certainly talking about the same God. Some of us know people that, for instance, you might know somebody and I know somebody and we share that, but then we've had very different experiences of those people. So you begin to describe a person, I say, that doesn't sound like the person I know, but it is the same person. And so I think in many ways, this is the way we look at God. We have different perspectives, and those perspectives color our understanding of God. But the God that we're talking about is the creator of the heavens and the earth, sustainer of all things animate and inanimate. And this is the God of even the Hindus, despite all of their various manifestations and things. If you get into the Vedic scriptures, you'll find that they're really talking about a very similar understanding of what they call it the nirguna, as opposed to the sirguna, the unattributable God, the God, the unknowable God. And so the Godhead, the unknowable Godhead, I think is the same for all of us. When we get into attributes, I think then there's going to be some differences.
The argument is that when you look for that commonality, the lowest common denominator, to be a bit pejorative, you wind up with almost nothing, just a kind of a ground of being, and you lose all meaning. Is that a just?
I think that's excellent, because there's a great section in the Dostoevsky's The Possessed, where Shatov, he's got this character Shatov, he was an atheist, and then he kind of has this. He comes back to his faith in America, of all places, and one of the things that he says is that every nation has their own understanding of God, and if it wasn't for that, they wouldn't be a nation. They wouldn't have their distinct character. Okay. And I think it's a very profound insight. For nation, I would say ummah, which is the community, the ecclesia, the songhai, the minyan, all those things that bring a people together, that make them unique and distinct. So I think there's a verse in the Quran, which is very interesting to me, that it says, every people, we have given them a way, a shara, a way, and a minhaj. In Hebrew, they call it a minhag. That they have their own particular way. And it says, we did this as a test. So vie with one another in good. And so each community is going to see itself as unique. And it is, in reality, unique. But the real challenge is to prove yourself through virtue. And that's where the moral character of a community becomes so important, because by their fruits ye shall know them, as Christ said.
The challenge to that, of course, is that sounds good, but each of the major faiths, even if we stick within the Abrahamic tradition, there are overt contradictions between them. To pick religions that I'm more familiar with, between Judaism and Christianity, obviously the incarnation and divinity of Jesus, the nature of the Trinity. These are fundamental differences. And of course, Islam brings the prophet into it. So how then do you deal with what on their surface appear to be outright contradictions?
Well, I mean, first of all, we have to remember that the Jewish tradition recognizes both Islam and Christianity as Noahides. So within Judaism, we're actually we're Noahidic people. We follow at least 7 of the 10 commandments. So the Jews have never had a problem with the theology of the Muslims, and in fact have used it. I mean, they were influenced by the Kalam tradition. Some of the great Jewish philosophers like Moshe ben Maimon, Maimonides, and others. both of us, the Jews and the Christians, do have a problem with the Trinity. So we would both see the Trinity as a serious problem. We actually think it's an error, and it's very easy to see triads everywhere. That we have a whole science called trigonometry, which just deals with three. So three is a very powerful number in some ways, because it's really the, in Arabic tradition, numbers begin with two, not one. One is not considered a number in Arabic, but two is the first number, and it's from the two that comes the third. So all of creation comes out of the binary, and the male, the female coming together brings the third. And so, and then we're triune. We have a rational, we have an irascible and concupiscent soul. So it's easy to see how they fell into that mistake, but we believe it's a mistake. It doesn't mean that there's not great truths in Christianity. They're profound truths, but there can be errors. The Christians have had since the beginning a Unitarian tradition that has challenged the Trinity.